Hello and welcome back to Paleocast. My name is Dave Marshall, and for this episode, we're going to be diving into penguin evolution and taking a close look at a newly described giant penguin from New Zealand. I'll be interviewing the authors of this study, Simone, Giovanardi and Daniel Thomas, both of Massey University, and together we'll explore everything that you need to know about this new species, Kairuku waewaeroa, and about penguins in general. So, the obvious question we need to address first is, why hasn't there been an interview for what seems like an eternity? Well, I've been stuck in the middle of the North Sea again, working on an oil rig as a biostratigrapher. It's one of the only industrial applications of paleontology, and so I'm very fortunate to have this job, but it does mean that I have to just disappear for months on end at very short notice, so apologies for that. But in such instances when I am away, we do still have other content being regularly produced by our sister project, the Paleocast Gaming Network. There we use computer games to talk about prehistoric life and evolution. It's a whole load of fun watching this content, so please check it out on YouTube or your social media platform of choice. Otherwise, we've collated a list of all the other paleo podcasts out there, and that's available on our website from the main menu under Other Shows. There are approaching 50 different shows for you to choose from, so you'll never be short of great paleontological content. That said, I'm delighted that you're joining us here today. Finally, speaking of other shows, I've seen that many of them are now funding themselves through Patreon and making thousands of dollars a month in doing so. And fair play to them. I'm not going to tell you that podcasting is expensive or that we need the money to continue. For us, it costs $20 a month for audio hosting and a couple of $100 a year for our web hosting. Paleocast moving to Patreon is going to be a way of allowing us to give something extra back to the fans who already donate to the show, whilst improving the quality and diversity of our content for everyone. The ethos of Paleocast has always been to provide our podcast for free. We rely on our interviewees for the expertise they volunteer, and it'd be wrong for us to profit off of that. And nobody likes adverts. So any income from Patreon is going to be funneled back into the show to improve the quality and diversity of our content. $1,000 a month to us is a plane ticket to go and report on a big paleo conference. It's new live streaming equipment, new video gear, new hosts, and more episodes. And in return, we'd offer some completely new content. A live streamed Q&A, a virtual field trip, videos like PBS Eons make, or a lecture series featuring some of the biggest names in paleo. And in all of this, we'd be leaving the Paleocast podcast totally free and untouched. No paywall, no early access. Simply a way for us to improve our content for everyone's benefit by giving something back to those who opt into this scheme. So in the next few days, I'm going to post a link to a survey on our social media accounts. If you might be interested in backing us on Patreon, then your feedback will be greatly appreciated. So anyway, getting back to this interview, we've got pictures to accompany this episode available on our website, and any likes, shares, and reviews are always greatly appreciated. We also take episode requests, and just as I was recording this, I got a lovely email from Jacob, who's asked for an episode on bats just in time for Halloween, so I'll see what I can do for you, mate, and enjoy the New York traffic. And that's finally the end of this giant introduction. So, I hope you enjoy this giant episode on giant penguins. Simone, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Hello.
So, we always like to get to know our interviewees a little bit before we jump straight into all of the science that we're going to be talking about. So I'd like to ask you both how you got into the fields of paleontology and evolutionary biology. And Simone, if we start with you first.
Okay, so, well, the answer
it's kind of difficult to tell in some way, because it's that's kind of passion that you have since you're very young and a kid, when you like dinosaurs, but then you start also like other life form and other animals. And then I kept kind of like this passion always with me. After I left high school, I decided to go for biology and then natural sciences in the university. And so I kept doing this. And when I found that actually there was the possibility to do paleontology and study this sort of features and in real life, that's kind of like blow my mind. So I said, yeah, no, I want to do this kind of thing.
Sure. And Daniel?
Not too dissimilar, actually. So paleo's just been what I've always wanted to do. I was, that dinosaur kid, and I followed it through high school. My undergraduate was geology and zoology. My postgrad was in paleo. Always fossils.
Sure. And what would you both be doing if you weren't in academia?
Well, for me, it's kind of like straightforward in some way, because I always also had the passion for drawings and art. So although maybe less, maybe also difficult to find the right job in this kind of environment, maybe I would like to also keep doing art as a form of job.
Yeah, when you, spoiler alert, but when you sent through the picture of your new species to me, I realized that you'd actually drawn it yourself. I was just like, how talented is this guy? Like, I can't believe that you can be like a researcher and such a talented artist at the same time. It's unfair. You need to share some of your talents around.
Oh, okay, yeah, no.
Like I could.
Thank you.
If that was me, I'd draw like a stick line drawing of a penguin or something.
Oh, thank you. I don't think that I'm so good at it, but yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
And Daniel?
Yeah, so I don't have artistic talent to fall back on, but I gave this a lot of thought, actually. So after my PhD, I did a couple of postdocs, and I was really fortunate to be able to line, these postdocs up towards the end of my PhD, and then towards the end of the first postdoc, I had the second one lined up. But it was at that end of the second one, when I was starting to apply for faculty positions, I was really running through the back of my mind, what am I going to do if I'm not into academia? And so I really did start to map this out. And where I landed was something in the field of data analysis, right? So somewhere where I was still processing data, still doing something analytical. And then I'd also settled on the side of something that had a public good to it, so perhaps in some governmental role. And that was as far as I'd gotten, because then I was successful in getting my position. And so far, I haven't had to think about what I would do outside of academia. So I'm one of the very lucky ones.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So just to get an idea of like where you are in your careers. So Simone, you're a PhD student, and Daniel, what were the focuses of your PhD and postdocs?
So basically, I'm as you said, I'm a PhD student right now, and I'm at the third year of my doctorate degree, and I'm almost ready to finish. I have almost wrote all the thesis, so hopefully I will soon have something right in end. So yes.
How has the lockdown in New Zealand been for writing up your thesis? It kind of forces you to be inside and with very little to do. I see it as maybe kind of aiding the write-up process, which is really quite rigorous and difficult to do, and many, many months of just solid writing, right?
Yes, well, I think that perhaps a lockdown may have hit harder And I guess that probably other students will be hit harder if they rely more on a lot more on how to say on field analysis, right, or field data. For me, we have a lot of that data that was already collected in digital form. For example, like a scan of the bones. So I can still do something like morphometry and geometrical morphometrics, or still do some sort of data analysis on that while I'm locked in. Or also I can write, even if I have to admit that writing is not exactly. I cannot write very well when I'm locked down and I cannot move around. So it's kind of like my productivity get a little bit down. But also I had kind of like I with one lockdown that we had during August of last year, I was aiming to go to a museum here in Wellington to scan some data, some bones, and then that was postponed, and so I had to move everything, all my schedule, I have to move again a little bit down. So yeah, that is kind of like for me what's happened with lockdowns.
That doesn't sound too easy after all. Sorry. So Daniel, what were your research projects on?
Sure. So after completing a PhD, which was on fossil penguins, I then actually started a postdoc at the University of Cape Town with Professor Anusia Chinsami-Turan, and we were studying bone histology, but it was bovids, it was mammals, and we were really interested in this idea of the chemistry and histology of alteration, so early stages of fossilization or diagenetic alteration. So we had a project focused on this, and then that was a couple of years, and moving on from there, I was working with Dr. Helen James at the Smithsonian, so at the National Museum of Natural History in DC. And this was completely different. So this was about the evolutionary history of coloration in feathers. This was around the time that melanosomes had really been recognized as being important signals of coloration in feathers. And these were giving information about black and brown and gray feather colors. And I was curious to see if we could use other techniques to walk back the evolutionary history on the reds and oranges and yellows. And so there was that was sort of what I was doing.
Yeah, that's really fascinating that you've been looking at those kind of colors and pigments in feathers. We have had a couple of interviews on this before on this show. But I'd like to ask, so you both did PhDs on fossil penguins. So I just want to know, why penguins in particular? Why did you choose these projects?
Well, penguin are extremely fascinating, I guess. First of all, I guess that we can both agree that they are extremely charismatic animals, right? First.
Yes, they are.
But also, the fact is, one of the most fascinating thing that I found out while I was doing this PhD is that there are a lot of them, especially on the fossil side, especially compared to other birds. We have a pretty good sampling of species from a decent amount of time. So I guess that it's kind of like a extremely interesting group to study in this sense. There is still a lot of discoveries that needs to be done for these animals, and there is a lot of material, right? So
yeah, and Daniel, so you did a PhD in penguins earlier, and now Simone is your student. Do you see that there's a lot of questions that need to be answered about penguin evolution and penguins in the fossil record?
I do. So the great thing about penguins is they are an excellent context for some very interesting questions. So it's a group that's experienced this amazing ecological or evolutionary transition, right? So we're talking about a group of birds who are secondarily adapted to life in water. And so what does that mean for the changes in their body plan, the rates of evolution across this transition? So we can, and this is a group that, as Simone just mentioned, has an excellent fossil record after that transition. Not so great leading into it, but that's an aside. But what it means is that while they're a wonderful and charismatic group to study, they actually are an excellent group for us to gain a broader insight about ecological transitions that we can pick up through evolutionary time. So one way to view penguins is that they're just an awesome group, and the other is that they're a really interesting test case for some really interesting evolutionary questions.
Okay, so before we start to unpack all of that, I'd like to get down to penguin basics. So what are the characteristics that define penguins?
Sure. So these are wing-propelled diving birds. So these are animals that are moving themselves around in water using their wings rather than their feet. And they have thickened bones. And that's essentially it. So that's really what we're looking for in our earliest penguins. As penguin history proceeds, there are other features that accumulate that we can recognize as very penguiny features, but actually the earliest penguins look quite different to our modern ones. And so we're looking to see that they are wing-propelled divers that have these thickened bones.
So today, is penguin morphology and ecology pretty much homogenous? Is there any variation in it?
So today there is a little bit of variation. And so here we talk about this idea of allometry, which is that a shape changes with size. And there's a little bit of allometry in our modern penguins. And so what that really means is that our biggest ones that are living today are not just the same shape as the little ones, but just increased in size. There are some proportional differences, but not so much. So there's certainly more of this shape variation when we go back into time. So if we are thinking about all of penguins, including the fossil ones, there's actually quite a lot of penguin morphology. When we're just looking at our modern ones today, there's a reasonable amount of size difference, but not a lot of shape difference. And ecology is actually pretty conserved across this group, and it's this matter of scale. So if we're thinking about a group like Charadriformes, the group that includes seagulls and shorebirds, there are flightless divers in here. So that modern order of birds, incredibly diverse ecology. If we take a look at penguins, well, they're wing-propelled divers, and they go out there and they eat some kind of seafood and they come home, and that's where they're going out and how long they're spending out, and the type of seafood varies. But if we really pull back to that high level, there is a very consistent ecology for penguins.
And why do they have such a limited geographical distribution?
So I love this idea. I love this. And this is because I actually got to see penguins that were living in almost, well, some of their more northern extremes when I was in Cape Town. And this, of course, refers to the fact that penguins are a southern hemisphere group. They range as far north as the Galapagos, and actually they edge just over into the northern hemisphere when they're in the Galapagos. And then they also live around the coasts of continental Antarctica. But they've never made it into the northern hemisphere, except to the Galapagos. But there's never been some penguin invasion up into Europe, for example. And we've never found them in the fossil record. So the modern distribution actually echoes this fossil distribution. And as we'll talk about a little bit later on, they've got quite a, we can track them back well into deep time. So why is this? What is the limit on this? And there are theories around this. And they essentially come down to the expense, the energetic expense of being a warm-blooded bird, a warm-blooded animal, lives in the ocean, must enter the ocean to find its food. And so the further up the west coast of Africa or Australia or South America, or even around the east of South America, you're heading into warmer and warmer oceans, and perhaps there are fewer and fewer opportunities to find profitable foraging trips. So maybe it's just energetically too expensive to invade the north, if you like.
So would there be anything to, if I went down to Antarctica, picked up a penguin, put it in my luggage, flew it to the North Pole, chucked it in the sea, would they do all right there, do you reckon?
I wouldn't recommend it.
I'm not going to, just as a disclaimer, but...
Let's see, what does a penguin need? It needs to be able to regularly go out and find either fish or krill, and they are opportunists. So if you put them into an environment and they can see, they're visual hunters, so they can see some food to eat, then they could eat it. And there are equivalents in the north to what they eat in the south. So I would be curious to see if that would work. And we certainly know that there are convergent examples of penguin-like things that occur in the Northern Hemisphere, and these are within Alcidae. So there are, the great auk is an excellent example of this, a penguin-like animal that was probably doing something ecologically very similar. So yeah, maybe that would work.
To be fair, I kind of heard, I don't know if this is entirely true, but I heard that there was some Norwegian or Scandinavian researcher that actually tried to do this kind of thing. They released some yellow crested penguin. And I don't know if it's even in the 1800s, so quite early. And they literally released the penguin, and then they never see them again, apparently. So I don't know, maybe it's not true, but I kind of read this thing somewhere. So yeah, just to point out.
So if we have any Norwegian listeners, please go out and have a look, see if you can find them.
Yeah,
you did say Norwegian, didn't you?
Norwegian or Scandinavian?
Scandinavian.
Perhaps.
There may be other reasons. There may be navigational, there may be other ecological factors, but at an absolute basic level, we just think of these as animals that must forage in the ocean, obligate marine divers that have high energy demands. And so if, it should work.
Okay, so I'm coming into this interview with a very limited understanding of penguins, other than, like what you see on TV and films and stuff like that. So do you think, as two penguin experts, that people have many misconceptions about penguins? Do you have any, penguiny facts or something to set us all straight?
Yes. So there are some real classics here. And so these are things like knees and Antarctica and ice and polar bears, right? So there is this wonderful idea that penguins do not have knees, and that is, of course, not true. They just have bellies that are very fluffy, that extend down over their knees. So penguins have knees.
I can relate.
Oh, lockdown. And Antarctica, that all penguins live in Antarctica. And there are, if you have not done this, I would highly recommend searching out images of tawaki, which is a Fiordland crested penguin. And there are these just delightful images of these animals making their burrows in rainforest, right? So forest penguins, not just ice penguins. And of course, the penguins that live in these very warm environments as well. So not just Antarctica. And then, of course, polar bears interacting with penguins. This is the obvious one, that penguins, of course, are entirely a southern hemisphere group. So those are the classics. But this is this is a paleo podcast, and so actually there is something, and again we'll touch on this later, but one thing that people may not be aware of is actually just the age of this group, and that is that we can track fossil penguins back 62 million years, and I really like this idea. So Simone has recently produced this excellent image of a penguin meeting a moa, so one of these large flightless birds from New Zealand, and these moa are now extinct. So there would have been some first meeting, if you like, between moa and penguin. Well, at 62 million years, we're getting really close to the age of the non-avian theropods. And so I kind of like this idea that maybe one day there'll be enough evidence for Simone to do a reconstruction of like a parade of these early penguins marching in front of some non-avian theropod. So in terms of misconceptions, it's an old group, is I guess what I want to say.
Okay, so Simone, looking at the fossil record of penguins with you now, how good is the fossil record in general?
So we have, if we think about it, we have more than 50. I don't have all the exact number, but there are more than 50 species of extinct penguin, whereas we have 20 something around on the 20, depending on the research that you ask to, only 20 living species. So the number of fossil outnumbers the number of species. And for birds, it's quite unusual. So this is already quite something, right, to put in perspective or in the avian zoology, right? And the fact is that it's not only that they are concentrated, all these fossils maybe in a single point, but as Daniel said, we starting from 62 million years ago, we start to have some forms like the famous the waimanu, the sikiwaimanu, and that's already start from 62 millions. Then we have some in the Eocene, some in the Oligocene, like the one that we are going to present here, the Kairukus. They are from the Oligocene rock. Then there are some from the Miocene, and also spanning up to the recent one. We have actually a good coverage, also both in terms of species and in terms of distribution.
Okay, and you said that they compare favorably to other groups of birds. Why is that?
Well, it's probably there are many things in that plays here the role. One thing for sure is that, as we described initially, penguins have very thick bone, right? And this is already making, if you have a bone that is much more robust compared to the hair-filled bones that we see often in birds, this already makes you a little bit more easily to be preserved, right? And I guess that there is also an environment. The environment also play an important role here, right? We usually know that if you are stick to a marine environment, maybe you have more chance of being, fossilized and preserved. Whereas instead, maybe if you live more in foresty area or in area that have a little bit less probability of preserving the fossil, well, that's kind of like what is playing here. So I guess that there is some bias that allows the penguins to be more common, let's say.
And do we have we've already touched on this a little bit with Daniel, but do we have a good idea of their evolution in general? So we're talking both in terms of what they evolved from and then how they've changed themselves after they first evolved. I mean, to me, it seems that we have, Maniraptorans, feathered dinosaurs, then there's a bit of, then there's a big asteroid, and bam, penguins.
Yeah, well, that's how I would think it went, right? But anyway, we have the fact is that the most recent phylogenetic analysis on molecular data, they often found penguins related to Procellariform, right? The group that with albatrosses, the group holds together diving petrel, and shearbirds, the petrel, the giant petrels, all these sort of water-related birds. And these birds often form a group of other kind of water-related birds called the Aquiornitis. So I guess that maybe right now the evidence seems to point at Procellariform as the sister taxon, as the sister group of Spheniciforms. But maybe it's new evidence will point out something else. But to be fair, to me, make kind of sense, because I guess that probably the ancestral form of penguin should have been somewhat some kind of. I know that this is not a very good term but is pre-adaptation, right? Being already adapted to an environment that is watery before starting to developing the wing-propelled locomotion. So yes, this is kind of like I guess that maybe Procellariform is the guess that I would say as the most closely related birds to penguin.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question as to, well, I was going to ask whether or not their ecology, how they lived, and their morphology or their anatomy, like what shape they are, whether the ecology and the anatomy evolved hand in hand. So you're saying that they would have been well adapted to life at sea or on the water before getting penguiny in their shape. Is that right?
Yes, I guess that probably they here again, ecology and evolution are literally going, are maybe reaching one of hunting one each other's, right? They're kind of like a circles. There has been some really interesting studies on protopterids, kind of like the alter egos of penguin from the northern hemisphere that are another group of birds that are now extinct. They are mostly from the northern Pacific. And they, in this study, they were showing how possibly there are a series of maybe ecological jump that our wing-propelled divers need to do, like starting to being able to do some sort of fishing. I don't know if you are familiar with gannets or other the sulid that tends to literally plunge themselves by diving and then re-emerge. And maybe this is one thing that may start to trigger the input, maybe to start to move and to use the wing as a propelling structure. So maybe this is one of the triggers, but I guess that mostly, yes, living in water and in open water maybe allows them to evolve into these shapes.
So looking back over the entire fossil record of penguins from the very first, did they have very different anatomy or ecology?
Ecology, less so. So almost certainly they were marine wing-propelled divers since day dot, if you like, for penguins. But what's really exciting is as we walk through the penguin fossil record, we see these changes towards optimizing becoming a wing-propelled diver. So the wing bones broaden. We see reduced movement in the wings, and so that the wings become more of this rigid flipper, which just translates that stroke better into a more efficient form of motion in the water. They take on a form that would be more conducive to conserving heat. We see structures develop in the wings that we can associate with heat retention. And so our earliest penguins that we have in the fossil record, they look like capable divers, certainly. And then it doesn't take long for them to take on this penguin form, something that we would not mistake at all from a modern penguin. And that doesn't take very long at all to gain those traits. And then by the time they do, which is sort of late Eocene-ish, we've essentially got our penguin body plan. There are going to be a few changes over time, but penguins have looked like penguins for a long time.
We hear a lot, or at least I see a lot in the media, reports of new giant fossilized penguins. Does that actually reflect penguins in the fossil record? Is it that they were a lot bigger in the past, or is it just the media is biased on trying to report the biggest and largest new penguins discovered?
Yeah, sure. There is probably a bias, right? Also for the news in this term. Can you imagine just a giant penguin is something? Whoa, that's crazy, right? But yes, we have quite a different, quite a broad difference of form. But I guess that one of the things is also like that plays a role is, usually often bigger bones, right, tend to be fossilized more easily. So maybe we are completely missing some sort of diversity that we are not seeing, right? But still, we have some smaller form also from early stages. So still, the smaller form weren't completely excluded when they were when they were in the earliest stage of like in the Oligocene or in the Paleocene. So yes, there was still some smaller form, but maybe they get also less over the radar.
Okay, so the media and the fossil record can both be quite biased. How have penguins fared as a group over geological time? So you say that they are about 50 species that we know. Would you estimate that they're in decline, perhaps? Or is the modern age like the absolute best time to be a penguin? Can you even say?
Yes, it's kind of like to the studies that has been done. Probably, maybe right now is not the best time to be a penguin. There are relatively little diversity, and perhaps some studies has highlighted that there has been there could have been some sort of ecological major shift happening after the Oligocene, right? Because we don't see almost any more giant in the fossil records. Whereas if you think about it, that's kind of also like the period when maybe also the whales started to spread more in the water, as well also as the seals in general, right? So there may be also this sort of competition between other major clade that's developed during that period that may have hampered the diversity of penguin. So I guess that perhaps they are on decline given what we see on the fossil record, but obviously we would need to have more studies on this subject, right?
So let's focus now on your new study describing a new species of penguin, which, please excuse my pronunciation of the Maori, is going to be Kairuku waewaeroa.
Perfect.
Is that good? Yes.
That was perfect.
So how and where was this specimen found?
So this specimen was found in 2006 by, as you have heard from the media, that got a lot of attention by the Junats, the Juno Naturalistic Club of Hamilton. And they were on this canoe trip and they found this fossil. They were hunting for a sea urchin fossil, and then they found this fossil encapsulated in the rock, and they simply, they decided that was a really worth to take fossil. So yeah, that's kind of like.
So it was a load of kids.
Yeah, basically, yeah, yes, they basically were a group of kids, and then obviously the ones that's let's say that's to cut the block from the rock. It was needed some adult kind of work, right? But yeah, the cool thing of this fossil is that the kids had a major role right here.
have those kids been involved in what's happened to their fossils subsequently? Do they know that it's a new species, and how old were they, and how old are they now?
Actually, I got reached out by some of these some of the original explorers that found the fossil, and now they are right around the 30s, perhaps the one that they reached out to me, and some of them were quite happy to hear this kind of thing. That this is now officially scientifically recognized specimen.
Good. So it was found in 2006. What happened to the fossil between then and now? Was it just sat in a museum? Did nobody realize it was a new fossil when it was dug up?
So the fossil's discovered in 2006, and then almost straight away, the Hamilton Junior Naturalist Club, see the significance of this and organize to recover it, and they do, and they start the initial prep work on it. And they realize that actually this thing is really quite significant. So they reach out to the regional museum, and so this is the Waikato Museum in Hamilton, in the nearest city, and they loan it to the museum, and it will then sit there for a little while. Actually, it's on display periodically, and it's awaiting research. There are some researchers in the area. So there's a city just north of Hamilton. So this is Auckland, and there's a paleontologist there who will visit the specimen and take a look. But it's not exactly his expertise, and he has, some knowledge in this space, but not quite enough, and so doesn't pick it up as a focus. And there's another few visitors who'll take a look, but no one really picks this up as a project to describe. And in 2014, I started my position where I'm up in Auckland, and I knew this thing existed. And it was just there, giant fossil penguin, undescribed. So I head down to Waikato Museum and introduce myself and connect through to the Hamilton Junior Naturalist Club, and we start this project. We start gathering what we would need to describe this particular specimen. So the scientific work for me certainly begins in 2014, which I realize is still a little bit of a delay. And at this point, I'm going to completely throw Simone into it, because we were busy gathering evidence, and then I was joined by a wonderful PhD student in 2018, and I thought, you know what, it would be really great to use this as a training opportunity. This fossil already has this wonderful history of being discovered by young explorers. Let's carry forward on this idea and integrate it into Simone's PhD, so he can immerse himself into the penguin fossil record by exploring, by training on the anatomy of this particular fossil. Make this, a chapter where he gets to describe this thing. And so there was a little bit of time required to do this work. And so, yes, there has been a delay, but I think the end result is great.
Yeah, when I'm looking at my fossils of sea scorpions that were dug up in like 1850 or something, and yeah, there's a huge delay in some fields. I don't think that, like 15 years or whatever it is too bad, really. So, how old is the specimen? I'm not talking 15 years. I'm talking about which rocks did they come out of? Did you say it was Oligocene? And then also, what kind of environment do these rocks represent?
Okay, so to the date that has been discovered for the type of rock was around 34 to 27 million years ago. Technically, this is like the period, and with the microfossil that were assessed on that rock, we realized that it was realized that type of rock was probably a marine shelf environment. So probably the carcass of the bird, was how to say, was fossilized on this on a marine shelf. So
so it's kind of washed out to sea, or it died in the sea.
We don't know exactly, although there are some interesting taphonomical features of the fossil. But probably it died under the sea. It died, and then the whole body finished, on the floor maybe, and then it got covered with time.
Okay, and how much of the fossil is present? Have we got a complete specimen? And I guess generally, what has happened to it taphonomically? And by that I mean that taphonomy is the everything that happens to a body between death and digging it up, really.
So it's quite complete, although especially one thing about penguin that is interesting is that there are a lot of species, but often there is little overlap between each specimen. Right, you have one bone from this one, and then the other bone from another species. The really cool thing about this fossil is that he has so many bones. He has a complete wing, almost a complete wing, and and the femur and the legs of the. So those also are almost complete except for the ankle bone, the tarsometatarsus. Then we also have the coracoid, that is kind of like the shoulder bone of the birds. And also we have part of the sternum that is still there, and we have some finger, one of the feet, and also one from the flipper, and then part of the vertebrae that can be seen, and also like the part of the oscoxe, like the
pelvis.
The pelvis, yeah. Sorry. Yes, we have also the pelvis along with the synsacrum. So it's quite a lot for a penguin, I would say. It's definitely a decent amount. And one of the taphonomical things that are interesting about this fossil is that when the fossil was dug out, it basically was found that it has a femur that is completely disarticulated and turned upside down. So basically, it's almost like the head of the femur is in contact with the tibia tarsus. And that was initially we were thinking that maybe there was some problem with the preparation, but actually, if we look at the rock, the bone sits perfectly in that place, in the way it is. So something happened maybe when the bone when the specimen fossilized, and I was thinking that perhaps it could have happened some sort of bending of the knees, that we are already demonstrated that knees are a thing for penguin, right? They exist. So maybe there was some bending while the cartilage and the ligaments were still there, and then by the process of taphonomy, and when there has been some pressure down, maybe the femur simply flipped its position. So yeah, this is kind of like the another neat part of this specimen.
I always like to remind people that fossil organisms do not fossil as, like a perfect animal. They are decomposing, they are dead, they are rotting, they are gross. And yeah, the bones are bending backwards and flipping around, it seems. So it wouldn't have been a very pretty sight, I don't believe.
Yeah.
So it's a giant penguin, okay? But how giant is giant? How does it compare to the other specimens? And were you fully able to provide an estimate for the size of it?
So yeah, we actually did in the paper. We tried to put some numbers on there, but I think that when we think at giant penguins, I think that it should be also put beforehand, right? We should have discussed this earlier, right? But giant penguins are not real giants, right? When we think, usually probably the term is more to say that they were bigger than the penguins that live today, right? The biggest one is the emperor penguin. And these penguins that we see that are so-called giant, they were bigger, right, than this penguin. But doesn't mean that they were really, really so big. And by looking, for example, one thing that's emerged right for after the first time that the Kairuku were described is that they were relatively maybe short and compacted. So yes, they were bigger than the emperor penguin, but maybe whereas the emperor penguin is 70 centimeters, right, on standing height, if we look at it, maybe these Kairuku were maybe a little bit more of a meter, 1 meter and 2, 1 meter and something. And I guess that also our Kairuku, the Kairuku waewaeroa, perhaps would have been around that measure. I think that perhaps could be around 1 meter and 30 centimeters, maybe around that. The size of a children, right?
Okay, that's still pretty big.
Yeah,
and give it a hug. It's kind of anyway.
I would hug it. Yeah,
yeah. It'd be impossible not to if you saw it. I don't think.
Yeah.
Looking at this penguin, then we. I'm taking credit for this now.
Welcome to the team.
In my research, so looking at your penguin now, can you ascertain to which group it belongs, like which family? So we know that it's a Kairuku. Are there many other Kairuku species?
So basically, we have done I run a phylogenetic analysis, right? So I started from a data set and I started decoding this specimen with the data that we have. And with the phylogeny on hand, we see that these specimen groups together with these penguins, the Kairuku from the South Island. And actually, there are two different species ascribed to these species that are Kairuku waitaki and the Kairuku grebnefite. And they are both from South Island and from Otago. But this is not this kind of our assessment didn't stop just with the phylogenetic metrics, but we can see also by how the bones look. If we compare the bones proportion right with the wing, with for example the carpometacarpus, the radius, the ulna, and humerus, right, all the bones from the arm of the penguin. When we compare it to the Kairuku grebnefite, that is one of the also a very quite complete specimen, we can see that the bones almost line up. They are slightly bigger in this specimen in the north, but they're really, really similar in size. Whereas instead, when we compare them and we put aside the bone of the leg, there is a kind of an interesting disproportion. So it's almost like the wing remained the same, right? The wing is the same, but the legs are of two different penguins, almost like looks like. So this is why we decided to ascribe as a new species, because it still falls inside the variability of the Kairuku, but he has something different from the other Kairukus. So this is kind of like the main reason on why there was this difference with other Kairuku.
Okay, so just to fill everyone in case they didn't know, the phylogenetic analysis is how you determine the relationships between all of the different penguins in this case. And then the phylogeny that you produce is a mathematical hypothesis of their relationships, which takes the form of a tree, like a family tree. It's how we produce family trees. And we've got the family tree that we're talking about on our website. So some of the images you can look at there to see what we're talking about. So this specimen, though, waewaeroa, it had long legs. Is that what defined it then, separated it from all the other species?
Yes, basically this. And there are also maybe also some smaller feature like the femur also, it's Kairuku tends to have a quite a stout femur, really stout. This one is slightly less stout than other Kairuku. And also there are some particular features also on the coracoid that are about some articulatory facet that are slightly different, but they are very similar overall on the shape.
And it's got a round elbow. Right? So the Olecranon is more rounded. So it's a long-legged, round-elbowed Kairuku. So
yes.
I think this would be an amazing arm wrestler.
This is a great prompt for a paleo art.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes, right.
And am I right in? Did I read it right that waewaeroa actually translates as to long legs?
Yes. Exactly. Y is the term for leg in general, or lower hind limb, and roa, it means long. So waewaeroa should mean long-legged.
Right. And where do the Kairuku fit within our understanding of penguin evolution? So they're in the Oligocene, they're relatively giant penguins. Were they the last of the giants? Where do they fit in?
So right now, they are among the latest really giant penguin that were found. These Kairuku that are almost at the end of the Oligocene. After that, we have still big penguin, but not as big as we found before. But there's also one thing that I should again also point out about the shape in general, because when we say long-legged penguin, right? Technically, the interesting is the real weird guy here is not Kairuku waewaeroa, but are the other Kairuku, because they have relatively smaller proportion with the hind limbs, when instead our penguin, or this penguin that we described here, has penguins proportion more similar to the living penguin, right? So technically, this should be seen also as a normal-legged penguin, is the Kairuku that maybe are the short-legged one, right? So also this is helps to point out that maybe Kairuku was trying to adapt to something else. They were doing something different in that period of time. So there is also this fact that maybe unfortunately I cannot obviously prove this, but I have kind of this on the back of my mind, that I think that perhaps Kairuku, this lineage was trying, obviously is not. I am not saying trying on purpose, right? But they were trying to adapt to maybe some other niche compared to other penguins, and that's why he had this sort of unusual body plan. And maybe this tentative, right, to change his ecology maybe is also due to some other ecological prompt, right, with other major radiation of mammal in the sea. So again, I cannot, I don't. This is kind of like just an hypothesis that I have, but it's not still ingrained in stone.
So, what difference would the size of the legs make to these penguins? So, we're saying that this one's identifiable by the length of its legs. The other ones have got shorter legs. Modern penguins have got longer legs. What difference does it make? Can we infer anything about their ecology, how they lived, based on the size of their legs?
Obviously, well, I would say that it's quite difficult to demonstrate a complete shift in ecology, right? Only based on leg, but maybe it's something, right? We can see that maybe shortening the legs, the leg is another way to get smaller, to reducing size, right? There are many ways in which organisms can change their sides in relation to some sort of environmental pressure, and maybe shortening the legs in Kairuku, it was something that actually was their way to adapt to the environment, maybe. So
I do like this idea. So we often see reconstructions of body mass based on a single element, because fossil record, we're often dealing with incomplete specimens. So you find a new bone from a new specimen, and you want to know how big it was and how heavy it was, and so you'll create some regression between the length of that bone and body mass and calculate it. But once you start to get these more complete skeletons and a series of them, and you realize that actually the modules or the regions within the body can actually change, then it entirely throws off these calculations. Because if you're, for example, calculating body mass entirely on a humerus, and yet they've all got these little Lego person legs, then it's going to be completely different, as if they all had these flamingo or stilt-like legs, because of the mass that the hind limb would contribute. So I think there is an interesting case to be made for really thinking about the contributions to body mass and what that ultimately means for ecology, as you were saying. I just want to follow up on where this specimen fits in within our understanding on penguin evolution, and that is it's outside of the crown clade. And so the crown clade for penguins, of course, is when we think about all of the living species of penguins, their most recent common ancestor, and then all of the descendants from that most recent common ancestor. And Kairuku waewaeroa lived before that most recent common ancestor for all the living ones evolved. And so what this is telling us is that this giant penguin that we've described, it doesn't have living descendants. It's one of these stem lineage penguins, or these stem penguins. It's an older, it's an ancient type of penguin, and there were others of these ancient stem penguins that would come after Kairuku waewaeroa, before the origin of the crown. So it is heading deeper into time for the lineage. It's the reason for pointing this out is when we're thinking about penguins that don't have living descendants, and when they have body proportions that we don't see amongst our living groups, it's actually really challenging to infer their ecology, because we just don't know what they were doing. We don't have a living example of it.
So are the Kairuku, this genus of penguin, are they cosmopolitan? Do you find them all over the place, or is it just in the northern island of New Zealand where you found this specimen?
So I love this idea. I love the idea that we've got these giant ocean-going birds in deep time, and they appear to be endemic, right? So every time we find one of these new giant species, we've only ever found it in one place. But if we think about our other very large ocean-going seabirds, so our living albatrosses, yes, they fly, but if we walk back in time a little way, we have our bony-toothed birds, and we have a good understanding that these were animals that were truly cosmopolitan. They were traveling great distances, crossing oceans, arriving in other land masses. We don't have any evidence yet that our giant penguins were transoceanic, that they were crossing oceans and occurring elsewhere. So we don't have any Kairuku from South America or Antarctica yet. So I really do. I like this idea that maybe one day we'll actually find out that these giants weren't endemic, that we've just found the first of their records, and perhaps they were big enough that they were able to go long distance.
And that leads me into some of the conclusions that I want to wrap this interview up with. So, fossilized penguin distribution. Are there tons of penguins still waiting to be found in New Zealand and all around the southern hemisphere?
Yes. And so that's actually one of the significances of Kairuku waewaeroa. It's come from an area in Aotearoa in New Zealand, where there had been some scattered fossil penguin bones found before, but really nothing of this significance. And yes, it has been sort of explored, but it hasn't had systematic exploration applied to it before. And so there are potentially these unexplored regions here and very likely elsewhere where we might find more.
That's exciting. Everyone get digging. If you're listening in Australia, in New Zealand, South America, South Africa, you know what to do. So are there many unanswered questions left in the field of penguin evolution? I mean, we've got potential new specimens to be found all the time, but is there a lot that we don't understand about their evolution?
There is, and it again is this question of scale. So we can, I mean, as you mentioned, at a fine scale, there's always the next specimen to describe, and perhaps it's a new species. But then we step out and we start to think about, well, why do we have this body size of penguins in deep time that we don't have today? So what happened to the giants? That's an unanswered question. And then we step out even broader and we start to view this as a group that's gone through an evolutionary transition. How rapid was that transition? How did the changes occur? Were there other groups that were closely related that perhaps were took on some other shape that didn't work out so well? So yes, it's still a very rich field for exploration. And I'm really excited that now that Simone has gained all of this experience, that he'll be taking it forward to answer these types of morphological questions, and perhaps they will be about penguins. But you know, he's now got this skill set with geometric morphometrics and other amazing analysis techniques that involve words, Bayesian and other things. And plus, he's a wonderful artist. So any research groups out there who are looking at taking on someone who I can greatly recommend, please get in touch with Simone.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the shout out.
And in general, does penguin evolution get the attention it deserves? And I'm talking not just from the public and from podcasts like this, but from academia as well. Are there enough people researching them?
Yes, so there are wonderful research groups that have penguins as a strong focus in a few different locations. And the issue is actually the same issue that paleontologists face everywhere, and it's that natural history science is just underfunded. And so while penguins are wonderful, the opportunity to work on them is dwindling.
And is the public interest still there, though? I mean, penguins are incredibly charismatic, and when you look at the fossil record and you've got giant penguins, relatively, that's fascinating. The public interest is there, surely. So
there very much is public interest in this group, and we've just been delighted with the response to us describing this fossil penguin. We're, of course, really indebted to the Hamilton Junior Naturalists for ultimately making this opportunity available to us. But yeah, the people love penguins.
And yeah, the news got all over the internet. That's where I picked up this story, and I'm sure that everyone listening might already have seen this. How far afield did the news of this get? Did it get in newspapers in Germany and articles in India and stuff like that?
While yes, it did, I will say to listeners out there that we're recording this with a 12-hour time zone difference. So mathematically, I believe this is the furthest away that it could have gotten.
Oh, brilliant.
Oh, yeah, right.
It's also the peak media.
That's right.
Yes.
But has the story been well reflected in the press? I mean, okay, so the tabloids here are completely awful, and it's going to be like, new giant penguin, was a monster killer at 100 tons of fish every day, sort of. And has the science been well reflected by the media?
Yes, it has. So we worked with our team here at Massey University to craft the release, so that way, we could get out in front and make sure that that the science was going to be communicated correctly. And we've been really fortunate, actually, with the response. So we've been in touch with a great number of reporters who are just very interested in hearing the full story. So the components around the discovery, the involvement of the school children, all the way through to the technical details. How tall was it? How do you know this? How complete was the fossil? So yeah, it's been wonderful.
The T-Rex of the Oligocene. Aquatic T-Rex. It's always got to go back to theropods of some sort.
It hasn't left theropods.
Yeah, I recognise that as I said it. I was like, yes, it still is a theropod. I'm not a vertebrate worker.
You have to choose your aquatic, highly derived aquatic theropod, right? Or Spinosaurus or penguins, right?
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, so what would you say to wrap this up? What would you say to a student who might be interested in the evolution of birds and of penguins?
I would say that there's still so much we don't know, and it doesn't take much to look at recent discoveries to see how quickly this field is accelerating. So for the longest time, it was Archaeopteryx and some other things. And then in recent, the last couple of decades, really, we've had this wonderful acceleration in this field. And we are really privileged to be contributing to it. And I would encourage any listeners to become the next generation that then is able to tell their story and make their contribution.
It's I guess that's interesting. This kind of thing, it's crucial, right? We want to have as many people working on our subject. It's really important for a healthy scientific community, right? So yes, choose you. I think it's just matter of finding the right subject, the one that has not yet been explored, but there is something there, right, that you should point, and then stick to it.
Okay, well, thank you both for coming on the show today. I have enjoyed it very much, and I'm sure our audience has done as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Paleocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall and Liz Martin Silverstone, with contributions from Tom Fletcher, Vish Venkat, and Elsa Pancharoli. Music was composed by Patrick Kendall Smith. Paleocast was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on funding from you, the listeners. So, if you've liked this episode, please consider donating, and thanks to everyone that's helped out so far. Please visit paleocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programs, and follow us across social media platforms to get all the latest news. Finally, if you enjoy our podcast, then please explore all of our video content on YouTube and follow our other projects, the Virtual Natural History Museum and the Paleocast Gaming Network.